Now, for all the grand promises from world leaders to tackle climate change, actually meeting those pledges involves far more than planting a few million trees. A new report by 50 of the world's leading experts has warned that the rapid decline of natural ecosystems and climate change are not separate challenges, but must both be tackled at the same time. And they say the future of human society depends on it. Here's our chief correspondent, Alex Tomlinson.
Once upon a time, our world leaders gathered in Cornwall to decide our future.
They are not alone. This week, a statement of the screaming obvious from 50 leading scientists that climate change and species destruction are part of the same vast problem. It is an agony, of course, which we see playing out across our world. The audience, right here, right now at Cornwall's G7. But are they listening? Because this week, news that the government has broken its promise to introduce clear legal targets to halt the UK's dramatic decline in wildlife, 60% since 1970.
There's still a very disappointing gap between the government's rhetoric on putting nature into recovery and tackling climate change and the reality of what they're doing here in the UK.
Sometimes people think of climate but forget habitat. This programme revealed last year how the Forestry Commission planted trees to store carbon. But on a blanket peat bog, precious habitat storing far more carbon. The plantation will destroy the bog. Last week the Commission told us it's now powerless to act. The tragedy of thinking in silos. For peat bogs, coastal mangroves, wetlands and of course rainforests provide our richest concentrations of animal species, whilst being vast carbon stores. Obvious proof that cutting carbon by preserving such habitats helps nature as well. So a direct message to the G7 tonight from one of Britain's most eminent environmental scientists.
The G7 has a real responsibility. They need to show leadership. The G7 governments must show how they're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, how they're going to slow down the loss of biodiversity and even restore biodiversity. So the G7 needs to send a very strong message to other governments, not just what the targets are, but what actions are they willing to take.
Fossil fuel industry like coal obviously destroys habitats for wild animals and unleashes carbon. But agriculture also pumps out vast amounts of carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide and ammonia. It destroys rainforests, woodlands, wetlands, the greatest land-based carbon capture system we have. Perhaps the ultimate proof that abusing nature abuses ourselves is, of course, COVID, the latest disease we've arguably inflicted on ourselves. It won't be the last.
This was being warned about 20, 30 years ago in UN reports that if we kept fragmenting and eroding wildlife habitat, it would increase the likelihood of pandemics. And we saw it with Ebola, we saw it with SARS, we saw it with Nipah, and now we've seen it with COVID. For goodness sake, if we haven't had a big enough wake-up call this last year that we've got to halt the biodiversity crisis, not just for the sake of the planet, but for the sake of our health and prosperity, COVID is it. We've got to act. Our future depends on it.
In short, in Cornwall, in the G7, time to act on biodiversity.
Well, joining me now from Brussels is European Commission Executive Vice President Frans Timmermans, who is leading the Commission's work on the European Green Deal. Thanks very much for joining us. The G7 is being painted as a make-or-break moment for the climate crisis. What must it deliver?
Well, I hope we can get some clarity on the commitments of the individual states participating in the G7. I also hope we can get some clarity on the climate financing for the developing world. And I'm so grateful to the United Kingdom for addressing the issue of biodiversity loss. And the previous item you just showed is really, really spot on. And I'm very grateful to you for actually airing it. So I think on these things, perhaps the G7 can show some leadership, and then we can take it into the discussion that has to lead to a positive conclusion at the summit we will be having in Glasgow in November.
I mean, all the G7 countries have targets to reach net zero emissions, and yet progress globally has been painfully slow. Would you like to see something really much more radical, global agreement to consign the coal industry to the bin, for example?
Well, Well, I have to say that in the last year or so, things have really changed in a positive way. I think there's a really broad coalition, worldwide coalition, emerging on climate neutrality, or at least carbon neutrality, by the middle of the century. The net zero movement is increasing very rapidly. The fact that the United States are back is also very helpful in the international scene. And you see some of the emerging countries also turning to this issue in a far more positive way. Countries like Indonesia, but also in India, you see some positive developments. China, that has committed to carbon neutrality by 2060. And you see many of these countries are also turning away from financing coal-fired power generation across the world. So I do see a number of really positive developments, but we need to speed things up.
Exactly, and in your own front yard, as it were, the European Commission President promises that the European Green Deal will give back more than it takes away. But for governments and people across the EU who still fear it will cost jobs and livelihoods, what more must be done to convince them?
Well, first of all, we have to show them that doing nothing will cost far more jobs and will create a world that's unlivable. Our children will be fighting wars over water if we don't change course. And secondly, if we organize this in a way that we leave no one behind, then I think we can convince almost everyone that this is a development we should encourage. The one issue I think that's going to determine whether we're successful or not is a social issue. Can we show that we're not going to have the most vulnerable people paying the highest price? Can we show that we can organize this on the basis of solidarity? Can we redefine the social contract that underlies our society? I think that's the biggest question for my generation and for the years to come.
But you can only really, truly convince people by action, can't you? Talking to them, we've been trying that for a long time.
Yes, but we're undertaking action. We will present 12 proposals in the middle of July that will increase our efforts to reach something that's now been set in law in the EU, which is to reduce our emissions by at least 55% in 9 years' time. And we've also set into law that we will be climate neutral by 2050. And that's binding on all member states. And we will propose 12 initiatives in July to show how we can do this. And then, you know, people can see that we can actually move in that direction rather quickly.
And sorry if you think this is a slightly cheeky move away from the environment, but it's understood that the Northern Ireland Protocol may well be discussed at the G7 tomorrow. How optimistic are you that this issue can be resolved?
Well, I think we owe it to the people of Ireland and Northern Ireland that we honour the Good Friday Agreement. For me, that's been the prime issue over years. I've always advocated to be very careful what we do, because peace in Ireland is one of the biggest achievements of my generation. And I think we owe it. We have a huge responsibility to make sure that peace is lasting. And I believe that all parties should adhere to the agreement we've reached. And I hope we can find a way out for this. But, you know, when you reach an agreement, when you sign up to something, you have to implement it.
OK, Frans Timmermans, thank you so much for talking to us today.